Today, we're diving into bilingualism. You know, a topic you're ready to explore beyond just the surface level.
Yeah, we've got a whole stack of sources here. Turns out it's way more than just like speaking two languages,
Wait, it goes so much deeper. Like we're talking culture, brain power, even how societies are structured.
It's fascinating how diverse bilingualism truly is. We're going to be considering age, how people learn, the impact it has on society.
It's like a window into the human experience, really. Okay, so first things first. How do we even define bilingualism?
Right. Is it just like being perfectly fluent in two languages? Like, is that it?
I mean, that's what I always thought, but...
Well, that's a great question, and it really highlights a key point. Fluency isn't this simple on-off switch.
Okay, so there are degrees of fluency.
Exactly. Bilingualism actually exists on a spectrum. You can be bilingual and still have like different comfort levels and skills in your languages.
So not all bilinguals are created equal. Makes sense. But what about that idea that you have to start learning languages as a baby to, like, really get it?
Ah, yes, the critical period myth. There's this persistent idea that if you don't learn two languages basically from birth, you've missed the boat.
Yeah, you hear that a lot. But is it true?
Well, one study we came across found that the peak age for actually grasping grammar is, get this, between 17 and 18.
Wait, 17 to 18, really? That's way later than I would have guessed. Why would that be?
Well, think about what grammar actually is.
Yeah.
It's all about, like, these abstract rules and patterns. It's possible that at that later stage developmentally, the brain is actually better equipped to handle those complexities.
Huh. So maybe our teenage brains aren't so bad after all.
Right. It might even have to do with social and educational factors that come into play as we get older.
That totally changes things. There's hope for us late bloomers who want to learn a new language. So there's no single perfect bilingual, like, how many different types of bilingualism are there?
Oh, tons. So many variations. I mean, some people acquire languages at the same time, others one after the other.
Right.
Some people understand more than they can speak. We call that receptive bilingualism. While others are super fluent in both, speaking and understanding, then there are terms like additive and subtractive bilingualism even.
Whoa. Okay, slow down. So what's the difference between additive and subtractive? Those sound pretty important.
They are, especially in places like the U.S. with so many different immigrant communities. Additive bilingualism is when you learn a new language, but you also keep developing your first language.
So like you're adding a new tool to your toolbox.
Precisely. Subtractive bilingualism, though, is when the new language kind of takes over. The native language starts to fade. Imagine like a kid who speaks Spanish at home but then goes to a school where it's English only.
Oh, right.
They might become less fluent in Spanish over time.
That's sad. Like losing part of your heritage. But hey, if over half the world is bilingual, like our sources say, maybe subtractive bilingualism isn't as common as we think.
That's a pretty mind-blowing statistic, right? Over half the planet using multiple languages daily. It really challenges those assumptions we have about what's normal, when it comes to communication.
So it's not the exception, it's almost the rule. Are there any places that really show us this diversity?
Oh, tons. Papua New Guinea, for example, has over 840 indigenous languages. Imagine the range of communication styles in just one nation. Then you've got India, where almost 30% of the population speaks at least two languages.
Wow, that's a lot of languages. What about here in the U.S.? I feel like we always get labeled as a monolingual nation, is that right?
Not exactly. English might be dominant, but the U.S. actually has a really rich history of multilingualism.
Really?
About 20% of the population is bilingual. And throughout history, all these waves of immigration have shaped our linguistic landscape. Think back to colonial times.
Okay.
You had languages like German, French, and Dutch being spoken widely alongside English.
So bilingualism in the U.S. has been there all along, even if it's not always in the spotlight. But it's not just about the sheer number of languages, is it? It's also how those languages are used in a society. There was that term, diglossia.
You got it.
Yeah.
Diglossia is when different languages have different social roles, almost like a hierarchy. Think of it like you wouldn't wear a ball gown to a backyard barbecue.
Right. No, you look a little out of place.
Right. Each outfit has its purpose. Similarly, in a diglossic situation, certain languages are considered more formal, more prestigious, while others are for everyday use.
Okay, I'm starting to see it. Can you give me an example, though? I'm still trying to picture it.
Sure. A classic example is Standard Arabic and Moroccan Arabic. Standard Arabic is often used for religious practices, education, formal settings. It's seen as that high status variety. But in everyday life, People in Morocco are going to use Moroccan Arabic. It's how they connect with family and friends in their communities.
So it's like having a formal language and an informal language. But if it's all Arabic, wouldn't people understand each other anyway?
They would, but it goes beyond just understanding. It's about cultural attitudes, even power dynamics. Using the right language in the right situation can send a really strong message about your identity, your place in the social hierarchy.
So bilingualism isn't just about what you can say, it's about how you choose to say it. There's like a strategic element to it.
Exactly. And that leads us to another super interesting concept. Code switching. This is where bilinguals switch back and forth between languages within a single conversation.
Code switching, that's where things get really interesting, I think. Tell me more about that. How do people use it?
Okay, picture this. You're a passenger on a bus in Nairobi. You're trying to get the conductor's attention, but he's ignoring you. So what do? You switch from Swahili, the common language, to English. Suddenly, you've got his attention.
Wow, it's like you pulled out a secret weapon.
In a way, yes. You've used language to shift the power dynamic. Bilinguals code switch for all sorts of reasons. To express solidarity with a group, to tell a joke that lands better in one language, even to exclude others from the conversation.
It's fascinating how much control bilinguals have over their language choices. It's almost like, I guess even monolinguals do this to some extent, right? Like how you'd talk to your boss versus how you talk to your best friend.
That's a great point. Adapting our language to different situations, that's a universal human behavior. Bilinguals just have a more expanded toolkit, multiple languages at their disposal.
But doesn't code switching get a bad rap sometimes? Like people thinking it's like broken language or a sign that you're not really fluent?
Yeah, definitely. There's a real stigma attached to code switching. And one of the most surprising things we found in our research is that code switching isn't random. It actually follows grammatical rules.
Really? There are rules?
Absolutely. There are even linguistic theories like the head complement principle and the matrix language frame model. They try to explain those intricate rules that govern code switching.
Oh, wow. Okay, I'm not sure I understand those completely, but...
Well, think of it like this. Imagine building a house, right? You can use bricks and wood together, but there are rules about how they fit to make a structurally sound building. Code switching is similar, combining elements of different languages, but in a systematic and rule-governed way.
Okay, I see. It's not just jumbling words together. It's more like a subtle and skillful linguistic dance.
Exactly. And the fact that some of these code mix varieties have actual names for them, like Spanglish, Chinglish, or even Poglish, that shows their legitimacy as distinct linguistic systems. They've evolved over time, reflecting this unique cultural blend.
So instead of seeing code switching as wrong, we should see it as a form of linguistic creativity, even cultural expression.
I love that.
Speaking of creativity, what about the brains of bilinguals? Is there something different happening in there compared to monolinguals?
Now we're getting to the neuroscience. That's where things get really fascinating. There's a whole field dedicated to understanding the bilingual brain.
Ooh, brain stuff. This is where I'll need your expertise because this could get complicated.
Not to worry. Let's start by busting a common myth. Bilingualism doesn't delay language development in children. Studies show that bilingual kids develop language skills on par with their monolingual peers.
Whew, that's a relief for parents raising their kids with two languages. But what about how their brains actually process language? Any truth to that?
That's the million-dollar question, and researchers are still figuring it out. Some studies suggest bilinguals might use different brain areas for each language, especially if they learn them at different points in their lives.
It's like having two separate filing cabinets.
Exactly. But other studies show that really proficient bilinguals actually activate similar brain regions for both languages.
So it's not as easy as saying bilingual brains are different. It's way more nuanced.
Definitely. It seems to depend on things like, age of acquisition, how fluent someone is, even the specific languages themselves. What we know for sure is that the brain is amazingly adaptable. And bilingualism, with its constant switching between systems, is like a workout for the brain, promoting neuroplasticity.
Neuroplasticity. It sounds so sci-fi, but it's happening right now. So even if the bilingual advantage debate is still ongoing, we know for sure that speaking two languages keeps the brain active and engaged. But hold on. If more than half the world is bilingual, what does that mean for the future of languages? Will some fade away while others just, take over?
It's something linguists and anthropologists are constantly trying to figure out. The fate of a language depends on a whole web of factors. But one key element is something called intergenerational transmission, basically whether families pass the language down to their kids.
So speaking the language at home is like the most important thing for keeping it alive.
Absolutely. But it goes beyond just family. Community support, where the language is actually used and celebrated, is also vital.
So think cultural events, language classes.
Exactly. Even informal gatherings where people can connect using their shared language.
Creating a space for that language to thrive. But what about the role of institutions, like governments? Can they help preserve languages?
For sure. Institutional recognition can be a game changer. If governments actually value minority languages and support education and cultural programs, it can really help revitalize languages that might be at risk.
It's like giving them a lifeline, showing that they matter.
Exactly. And never underestimate the power of attitudes. If people see their language as a source of pride, a part of their identity, they're more likely to use it and pass it on.
Like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you believe in the value of something, you're going to help it grow. This has been an incredible deep dive so far, so much to think about. Any final thoughts for our listeners before we wrap up this part?
As we continue exploring in the next part, here's something to ponder. If you could learn any language in the world, which would it be and why? What about its culture or how it's spoken makes you curious? Think about it. We'll be back to dive even deeper into the world of bilingualism.
Welcome back to our deep dive into bilingualism. You know, in the last part, we talked about diglossia, where different languages have like different social roles.
Yeah,
right?
that hierarchy thing.
Exactly. But what happens when you have bilingualism in a society where there isn't that clear hierarchy?
That's a great question. It happens all the time, and immigration plays a huge role. When people move to a new country, they often become bilingual, kind of out of necessity.
Right, they have to adapt.
But the host country's language practices might not change that much.
So it's like the responsibility falls on the immigrant to adapt, even if the larger society doesn't really embrace their language.
Exactly. Immigrants are expected to learn the dominant language, but the reverse isn't always true. Think about it. How often do you see native English speakers learning Spanish or Mandarin when they move to a neighborhood with a large immigrant population?
Not very often.
Yeah.
So even without a formal diglossia, that power dynamic is still there, where the dominant language has this certain prestige.
You got it. It creates a kind of diglossia, but on an individual level. Immigrants might use their home language in some places, like with family.
But then use the dominant language at work or school.
Exactly. And this situation can go on for generations, especially if the immigrant community actively maintains its language and culture.
But what about when that support fades? Do languages just disappear?
Sadly, yes, it happens. It's called language shift, where the dominant language slowly replaces the home language, and you lose some of that linguistic diversity. Like, imagine a family that immigrates to the U.S.
Okay.
Over generations, English becomes the main language spoken at home. That's language shift in action.
It's kind of sad, like a slow fade. I mean, losing a language is like losing part of a community's history, their identity.
Absolutely. And it highlights how fragile languages can be, especially for minority groups. Without that active use and support, they can vanish. And with them goes a whole world of cultural knowledge, unique ways of seeing things.
Speaking of fragile languages, what about endangered languages? We touched on them earlier, but I'm curious to know more.
It's a tough topic, but important. Did you know that over half of the world's languages have fewer than 10,000 speakers? And some have even less, like under 1,000.
Wow, I had no idea. What causes a language to become endangered?
It's usually a mix of things. Sometimes it's war or colonization, where dominant languages are imposed, indigenous languages are suppressed, like what happened with Native American languages here.
Right, a forced assimilation, basically.
Exactly. But sometimes it's more gradual. Economic or social pressures lead people to choose the dominant language. They see it as the key to opportunity,
So it's not always like overt oppression. It can also be about these subtle things that influence people's choices.
That's a really important point. Language shift often happens because people are making, what they see as rational decisions.
Yeah.
If speaking the dominant language opens doors, it makes sense why they would prioritize it.
It's like a survival strategy, in a way.
Exactly. But the consequences are huge. When language dies, it's not just words and grammar. It's cultural knowledge, history, ways of seeing the world that are lost. Imagine, losing those traditional stories, the songs, rituals that have been passed down for generations.
It's like losing a piece of the human puzzle,
Yeah.
a unique perspective that you can't ever really replace. So what can we do to protect these languages? Can we even reverse things?
There's no easy answer, but we're not powerless. One crucial thing is that intergenerational transmission, making sure younger generations learn and use the language.
So speaking the language at home with kids.
Exactly. It all starts there. But it can't stop there. Community support is essential too, creating spaces where the language can be used, celebrated. Think language classes, cultural events, even just those casual get-togethers where people can connect.
Building a community around the language. What about institutions, though? Like, can governments actually help?
They can. Absolutely. If governments recognize the value of these languages and support things like education and cultural programs,
It can make a difference.
a huge difference. It shows those languages are valued, that they're worth protecting. And never underestimate those positive attitudes. If people see their language as something to be proud of, a part of who they are.
They want to keep it alive.
Exactly. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Believe in the value of something, and you're more likely to nurture it, help it grow. Language revitalization is complex, but it's not impossible. It takes a lot of effort from individuals, communities, and institutions working together.
A team effort. I'm curious, what about linguists? What role do they play in all of this?
Linguists are kind of like language detectives. They work to document and understand these languages before they're gone.
So they're like out in the field, recording native speakers, making dictionaries, that kind of thing?
That's a big part of it. They record audio, video, conduct interviews, even work with communities to develop written materials. It's like creating this linguistic time capsule, capturing the language for future generations.
Wow, so important.
It's crucial for any revitalization efforts. Having that record of a language's structure, the vocabulary, the cultural context, it's an amazing resource for anyone who wants to learn it, revive it.
It's like having the blueprint to rebuild something precious.
Exactly. And linguists don't work alone. They collaborate with the communities, share their knowledge, help develop language learning materials, programs. It's a true partnership.
Bringing together the scientific knowledge and the cultural understanding.
Right. But, beyond all the statistics and trends, we can't forget that there are human stories here. People living in multilingual worlds. Their experiences are fascinating.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. There was this study that looked at language use in 2 bilingual programs, one in the US, one in Germany. They looked at Spanish-English bilinguals in Illinois and German-English bilinguals in Berlin.
Oh, cool. A cross-cultural comparison. I bet they found some differences.
They did. The German-English kids were much more careful to keep their languages separate, while the Spanish-English kids, they code switched a lot more, blended their languages.
Oh, wow. Why do you think that was?
Researchers think it has to do with social status, perceptions of, cultural capital. In Germany, speaking both languages well was a mark of being, an elite bilingual.
So mixing them might have been seen as, lowering their status.
Exactly, like wearing designer clothes and then throwing on a mismatched accessory.
Interesting. But the Spanish-English kids in Illinois didn't have those same inhibitions.
Not at all. They were much more comfortable blending their languages. It reflected a different social context.
So they were kind of embracing their bicultural identity through their language use.
Exactly. Code switching wasn't seen as a mistake, but as a natural and expressive way of communicating.
But if it's so natural, why does it still get such a bad rap? We talked about the stigma before, but I'm still kind of confused by it.
It comes down to societal attitudes and power dynamics, really. Code switching is often seen as, broken language, a sign that someone isn't good at either language.
Oh, like judging someone for their accent. As if that tells you how smart they are.
Exactly. And those negative attitudes can have real-world consequences. They can affect people's chances in education, careers, even their self-esteem.
So it's not just about linguistic prejudice. It's about these deeper social inequalities that are, reinforced through language. It's a reminder that how we talk about language matters.
Absolutely. The way we talk about language can either empower or marginalize people. It's so important to challenge those negative stereotypes. Recognize the richness and complexity of code switching.
It's like appreciating a mosaic, right? Where all these different pieces come together to create something beautiful and meaningful.
I love that. And, a lot of bilingual communities have actually embraced code switching. They've given names to those unique language blends.
Like Spanglish, Chinglish. They're expressions of cultural identity.
Exactly. These names show a sense of pride, ownership, reclaiming something that was once looked down on.
It's powerful, like saying, this is how we speak, and we're not ashamed of it.
Right. Language can be a tool for resistance, challenging the norms and showing your identity.
It makes you realize that language is always changing, adapting to the world around us. Bilingualism is like a perfect example of that.
And as we'll see in the next part, it also shows just how flexible and resilient the human brain is.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening. Any final thoughts for our listeners before I move on?
As we continue exploring, think about this. How has your language use shaped your own identity and experiences? Whether you're bilingual, multilingual, or monolingual, we all have a story to tell.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We're wrapping up our exploration of bilingualism. And, I'm kind of excited for this part because we're finally getting to the brain stuff.
Yeah, it's really amazing to think about. Something as simple as speaking another language can have such a big impact on our brains.
I know, right? It's wild. So we already debunked that myth about bilingualism delaying language development. But what about bilingual adults? Like, what's actually happening in their brains? Is it different from, monolingual brains?
That's the question, isn't it? And researchers have been trying to figure that out for decades. One of the big debates is whether bilingual brains process language differently. Some studies show that bilinguals might use different brain regions, like separate areas, for each language, especially if they learn them at different times in their lives.
So is it like having two separate filing cabinets, one for each language?
That's a good way to visualize it. But some other studies have shown that really fluent bilinguals, they often activate similar brain regions for both languages.
So it's not a clear-cut thing? There's no single bilingual brain?
Exactly. It's more complex than that. It seems like it could depend on a lot of factors. When you learn the languages, how fluent you are, even with specific languages we're talking about. But one thing we do know for sure is that the brain is incredibly adaptable. It's always changing, rewiring itself based on what we experience. And that ability, that's called neuroplasticity.
Neuroplasticity. It sounds so futuristic, but it's happening all the time. So bilingualism, with all that switching back and forth between languages, it's basically like a workout for our brains.
That's a great analogy. And there's some research that shows this mental workout might actually have some benefits cognitively, like boosting your attention, working memory, even the ability to switch between tasks easily.
So could speaking two languages make you a better multitasker? A better problem solver, even?
Some studies suggest it could. And there's even evidence that bilingualism might actually delay cognitive decline as we age, like offering some protection against things like Alzheimer's.
Wow, that's incredible. So learning another language could be like an investment in your brain's health for the future.
It's a promising area of research for sure. We need more studies, but the possibilities are exciting.
It's pretty mind-blowing to think about. Something as simple as speaking another language could have that kind of impact on our brains.
It really shows that connection between language and cognition.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive into the world of bilingualism. We've learned so much, the social dynamics, the brain stuff. It's fascinating.
It's been a pleasure exploring this topic with you.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope our listeners have a new appreciation for bilingualism, for how complex and amazing it is.
Absolutely. Any final words of wisdom for our listeners before we wrap up the whole show?
Just embrace the diversity of languages and cultures out there. Whether you're a total polyglot or just curious about other languages, there's always something new to learn. Learning a language is like opening a door to a whole new way of thinking and seeing the world.
Beautifully said. And remember, language is so much more than just words. It's part of who we are, how we think, how we connect with the world. So keep exploring, keep learning, and keep celebrating the power of language. That's a wrap for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.